Hello, and welcome to another edition of The Tigers Down Under. I'm your host, as always, Alex, and with me tonight I have Dan.
Hey Alex, good to be back. Two in a row. Been a while.
Yeah, two in a row, and it does look like our worst fears were confirmed. We thought perhaps with the podcast returning last week that we might be the jinx that sort of broke the winning streak of the side, and unfortunately that was the case. But on the other hand, looking at it with the glass half full, to think that at this stage of the season, taking a point away from Villa Park would be seen as disappointing, and to have been 2-0 up and a chance to win the game and go within a point of the top six, it does sort of underline how far we've come this season. So in a way, it's a very uplifting sort of result.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we both expected to probably carry on the winning run and go seven wins in a row, but it's still I think 10 games unbeaten.
Yeah, it
So it's
is.
still in the league that is. So it's still a good vein of form, and as we are just talking about off air, when you consider that Device, who's been probably the standout centre half over the last 6 weeks or so, went off just before half time injured. Um, and then we had to, I think Mackenzie came in, and so he's played about 2 games of senior football. So, and not that
Yeah,
he performed poorly, but he was caught. I think he was caught out a little bit. And Aston Villa was able to come back. Replied as soon as Device went off, and then were able to claw one back in the second half. So I still think it was a fair performance considering the circumstances.
yeah, and I think it's harsh to criticize Mackenzie too much, but I think it does underline. I mean, when we were linked to Connolly from Cardiff, and we sort of thought, well, the defense is performing quite well. We've got a couple of guys in reserve. Is it really necessary to bring in another centre back? I think this does sort of underline the need for a bit more depth back there, where to have a kid with about 2 or 3 games experience coming off the bench, you probably, if you want to be serious about making a push for not only the playoffs but also promotion, you really need a bit more experience back there, I think. But yeah, it does sort of it's Device's transformation over the last couple of months is one of the more impressive ones in the squad, and like you said, it sort of underlines how important he is back there. That we basically conceded from the first attacking play Villa had after he went off. So it's disappointing to see he'll be out for I think up to 2 weeks. I think Adkins said, um, but at the end of the day, a point is a decent point, as you say. 10 games undefeated now. I think we've moved up in the table now. We're in eighth position. Yes, 6 points off the playoffs now instead of the 4 points it was before, I think. But it's still a positive. And Bowen on the score sheet yet again.
Yeah, and I think the 6 points isn't that big an issue when you consider there's plenty of teams above us of the 7 teams above us. I think there's not many that we've played twice.
Yeah, just
So there's
Leeds
yeah, it
perhaps.
might only just be Leeds. So there's still plenty of opportunities to take points off those teams above us, and
Of
like
course, they're going to play each other
what
as well, so you know.
yeah, and then when we're going to go over this soon, but we've got Blackburn this weekend, and they're very close to us, behind us. So if we can take the points off them, we start to build that gap
Yeah.
between not only like close the gap between us and teams above, but start to hopefully build a little bit of a buffer between us and those teams below us.
Absolutely. So on the performance on the team on the pitch, probably it's kind of harsh to say, obviously, but probably our worst defensive performance of the year so far in terms of calendar year. I think the last time we conceded 2 goals would have been late December, perhaps. Obviously, clean sheets in our last couple of games. Can't be too critical of Marshall, though. I think he had another good performance, and I thought the midfield performed quite well. I think Stewart was a little bit slow to get into the game, but once he hit his groove, he was another one who was very impressive. And Evandro was sort of singing his praises last week, but Evandro, Bowen, Grzycki again, that attacking trio in midfield were just absolutely outstanding.
Yeah, I think Evandro's when he's been able to stay fit, he's really shown his class and what he's capable of. It's just unfortunate that he's sort of been. ever since he's come to City and probably a little bit before as well, he's been plagued with those soft tissue injuries, and
Yeah.
they're really hard to shake properly, and that's sort of been the problem. He said he worked really hard over the off season, and he thought he was in the best shape, and then unfortunately picked one up, and it just took him a while to get over, and so hopefully, fingers crossed, there's he sort of turned that corner and there's no more of that because he's could well very well be crucial to how the our fortunes are over the last half of the season. And I mean, he's only been a couple of games, that since Irvine left, but that was the role that Irvine was mostly playing.
Yeah.
And I mean, if Evandro continues in that vein of form that he's sort of in, I mean, Irvine might even come back from the Asian Cup and find it a bit harder to get a start every week.
Yeah, and of course we'll talk a little bit in a second about our newest signing, but he's another one who'll add a bit of depth and competition across the midfield. And even Chris Martin up top, I just wanted to touch on him as well. It's very easy for a striker that isn't scoring a lot of goals to be quite maligned by the supporter base, but I thought he did put in quite a good display, and you have to think that shot he had towards the end of the game that the Villa keeper made a tremendous save to keep out. If that goes in, all of a sudden he's the hero of the match, and it's a very different story. Can understand why some might be a bit critical of him not putting away his chances, but he was involved in both goals in the build-up play, so I think you can't fault him too much. I think if anything, there might be a bit of frustration that he was kept on in place of Campbell coming off the bench, which is perhaps my one kind of comment around the way we performed on and off the pitch, was whether throwing Campbell on late might have given us just a little extra dimension and another roll of the dice to try and get the 3 points.
Yeah, I think Chris Martin's he's had an interesting time so far with us, but I think like even Adkins came out might have been in the last week or so and said that there's much more to
Yeah,
Chris Martin's role than just scoring goals, and I think that has to do with he's got so much experience in the league and all of that, and I think his value his like value as an asset to this team is sort of beyond his goal scoring. If he can start to get some, and I think he will. Like he got that one against Bolton, and he's getting closer and closer to like to breaking, to getting another goal, and I'm sure he will. Um, but he's performing well. It's not like he's cutting a lonely, lazy figure or anything out there. He's working hard and he's getting chances. He's just not quite able to capitalize on them at the minute. But it sort of happens. I mean, he hasn't really played that much football, even since he came to us. Like he's getting more than he was before. But strikers always they take a little while to sort of to get that eye for goal back in. So. Um, it just depends how they if we're like we're sort of got Campbell in a sort of in that wool blanket at the moment, trying to keep him a bit protected. Because obviously he's vitally important to us over the back end of the season. So, like Martin's going to get more opportunities, and I'm sure he'll start to get some goals soon.
and on the injury to Device, are you a little concerned about our fragility down back, perhaps in his absence? I know we've got Burke and um, I really I don't think Mazook's fit at the moment, is he? So it's kind of going to be interesting to see how we line up on the weekend, whether Lehigh plays at centre back, perhaps. I don't know what other options we really have. I think most likely formation I could see is probably Lehigh and Burke with Kingsley and Kane as the fullbacks. But does that sort of raise questions around how solid we can be? I know we've been so good over the last stretch of games with our defence, but I think a large part of that's down to Device's form.
Yeah, I think as you mentioned before that devices like we sort of thought that we were reasonably stocked in the defense, but we've sort of been given a very stark reminder of probably how the lack of of real depth. We had
Yeah,
depth in numbers, but we probably not depth in quality.
yeah.
So I think I'm not sure how far away Mazook is, but I mean I hope he's close because if he could come, like if he was able to be available, even if it's not this week, but it's next week or whatever, is the more that he can play, because he's performed pretty well in the. I
Yeah,
mean,
Mazook's another like Evandro where he seems to be quite a quality player. He's just, you know, there's always got to be an element or a drawback to a player that finds them playing for a team in the second division in England, whether it's, not quite being good enough or having injury issues. And I think for guys like Evandro and Mazook, it's definitely the latter, that it's just they're not fit consistently enough to ply their trade at a higher level. But when they're on the park, they're quality players. And you're right. I mean, if we could get Mazook fit for even just a couple of weeks, it kind of is a stopgap solution while Device is out injured.
yeah, I'm looking. It says that on it's only Hull Daily Mail, but it says that Mizuki and McKenna are in reserve, and it was only a
Okay,
few days ago, just a week ago, so before the last match. So um, they
that would
must
be quite
be, or might have
fortuitous
been
if
just
if he's fit,
some.
then he'd be the obvious one to come straight back in.
Yeah, so and the other thing is like it's always hard. Like I suppose like the other thing with if they were going to play Mackenzie again, at least this time
Yeah,
he knows he's going to be in there. He's got that whole week, of training to work with Burke and within that team. Like I can only imagine what it's like to, normally they're coming on, they might be getting 10 minutes at the end of the game as sort of, go out and get a bit of experience, and then to have, a influential figure in the team who everyone's been going, this guy's playing amazing. All of a sudden he comes off injured and you get thrown in. You can only imagine what's going through his head. So it was obviously would have been hard for Mackenzie, but I think, yeah, maybe with a week, I probably still would prefer I probably would bring Lee High inside and play, yeah, Kingsley and Kane, I suppose, as the wing, as the wide defenders. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens.
and I think in some ways, or hopefully, this will sort of motivate the club to really make a push and a breakthrough in the transfer window. I know we've been linked to Mings in the last couple of days from Bournemouth as well. Um, but I think that's definitely an optimistic one. I think he's one that would command either a transfer fee or would be on decent wages at Bournemouth. And I know they're looking to offload him on a permanent deal. And I think a couple of clubs like Leeds and West Brom and perhaps even Derby are in for him as well. So I think there'd be pretty stiff competition for Mings. I think we'll have to set our sights a bit lower. But if we can just get some sort of defensive backup option, whether it's on loan or whatever it is, I think it's one of those frustrating situations where I think if the owners were serious about a promotion push, I don't think they'd necessarily have to spend a lot of money, but just a little bit, just push the boat out a little bit, and as a kind of wild extreme. I mean, you could even look at someone like a Jagielka at Everton, who, yes, he'd be on huge wages, but the experience and the knowledge that he would bring to the dressing room would be immense, and would be an obvious sort of one to sort of have a look at and have a go at. But even looking, further down the league or even, outside of England, there would be options out there that, yes, they wouldn't be cheap, but they're not going to be, it's not like a £10 million transfer fee or something like that. It'd just be, a decent chunk of wages perhaps for 6 months. If you wanted to sort of do that sort of short-term gamble where you don't have that commitment into next season, you're not buying the player, you're just bringing them in on loan. Um, I struggle to see how there's much of a downside to just sort of having a bit of a go over the last 6 months of the season. And maybe this injury sort of and sort of the injury and then the fallout from the injury, the consequences on the pitch might sort of make the club sort of take another look and consider going and dipping into the market.
Yeah, I think like considering like when you look at how much money we've spent on players like over the last 2 years, really, like it's been minimal compared to like the teams that are spending a lot of money and they're the teams that are like basically really fighting for those automatic promotion spots. So to be in the position we're in and have spent so little on transfer fees
We're
and
basically the Tottenham of the championship.
yeah, yeah, essentially we're defying all expectations at this stage, and I think obviously, we've spent so little, the owners don't want to spend a lot, but I think you're right in saying it's not, to say, there's plenty of players that are going to be out there at the moment who either are running out of contract and not playing a lot of games or are, at clubs that aren't performing well that are, the player themselves might be. might be all right, but they're at a in a currently, got a contract with the club that looks like they might be going down. And there's plenty of players that will be very happy probably now to look at a team that's on the up. Like we've become a much more attractive proposition than we were 4 months ago.
Yeah, and moving on now to talking about the player that has signed for us, and he spoke in his first interview for the club about how the winning run that the club's been on has really sort of been a big boost coming into the camp, and that's Marc Pugh signing from Bournemouth, who interestingly says that he spoke to Elphick in the last few days before making the move across, and Elphick speaking so highly of the club, of the manager, of the squad. He seems like he's one of those players where you look at the reaction from the Bournemouth supporters with him leaving, and it's nothing but well wishes for him, and all of this talk about how much of a professional he is, how passionate he is, and that's the sort of player you want to be bringing into the squad. And he's exactly that mold of a player who is, I think, 30, 31, running to the end of his contract at Bournemouth, has so much experience getting promoted from the Championship, scoring a lot of goals in the division. He knows it well. And he can impart a lot of knowledge to the squad. Even if he sat on the bench, I think he's the sort of player who'll be quite happy just to be in and around the squad, getting his time off the bench, starting the odd game when someone like a Grzycki or a Bowen needs a rest, or an Evandro, because he can kind of swing across that front three. He's a really, really useful signing and a really great one to kick off our transfer activity.
Yeah, I think he is a good signing for all the reasons that you just mentioned. My only concern is that, like, with Tottenham and Tottenham, all those players have gone down injured in the last couple of weeks, and since we like spoke about, you know, there being reported interest, but Poch never having watched, and then since then they've actually sent scouts to our game, I believe, and there are rumors that they're actually now preparing an offer, and I don't know whether it's just rumors upon rumors, but does when before, like when the rumors were and they had a full squad, you were sort of like, well, there's not really any appeal to going, but if they now there's potentially, he's potentially someone like Bowen, it could be snapped up by another a team in a top division. I mean, if they're going to throw sort of 12, $15 million or pounds, I mean, at the club, Adams don't really have a history of turning down that kind of money,
Yeah.
regardless of whatever stance they've said they've taken. So that's my only concern. But at least like they, if he does go, it would be a huge loss, and I like Pew. I don't think will be is not going to replace him, but at least there's already someone at the club who can fill the role.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that was a concern expressed by Logan as well when we first heard the news of the signing. And I don't blame that sort of being where a lot of the thoughts go of, oh, well, we've just signed a winger. Bowen and Grzycki, in fairness, are both in great form and might attract interest from outside the club. It just seems to be the sort of signing that is more of a addition to the depth of the squad rather than a replacement, only because I just get the sense that if we were expecting an offer for Bowen, you'd almost expect us to be signing someone on a permanent deal. I mean, granted, Pugh's in the last 6 months of his deal, so we might just be looking at picking him up on a free transfer in the summer if he does well, um, which I suspect is what we're doing with Kane as well, who's in great touch
Yeah,
for us and is in the last 6 months of his deal as well. But yeah, look, I mean, until the window closes, you're never going to be certain that the players aren't going to leave. But I just think it would be really silly to sell now. I think especially, I think I'd be a little bit less surprised if Grzycki left than Bowen, only because Grzycki's in the last 6 months of his deal, whereas Bowen's, I think, still got 18 or even 24 months, 18 or 30 months left on his deal, I think. I know he signed that extension at the start of last season. I can't remember if it took him to 2020 or 2021. But that's the only thing. I just think they'd get much more value for him in the summer. So I think it would make less sense to sell him now. Although with the Allams, you never know. They might just, as you say, if a 12, 15 million pound offer came in, they might just think that's as good as it gets and just make the call then. But yeah, I mean, I try and look at the positives of the Pew signing and just hope that it just means, as on the weekend against Villa, we were talking about trying to throw Campbell on perhaps to change things up, but throwing someone like a Pew on in place of maybe Grzycki or Evandro maybe tiring as the match goes on, throw him on in place of them or a Henriksen or Stewart. to make it more of an attacking formation, um, to really kind of chase games towards the end of them. He's going to be a great addition, I think, and certainly is probably going to add more than Milinkovic at this stage from what we've seen.
Yeah, I think I mean, even just the more listening to you, talk your thoughts on the situation, it sort of even that just puts my mind a little bit at ease. But yeah, I think overall, I'm happy with the signing. I mean, I'd probably be happy with just about any signing the way it's
Yeah,
been going. But I mean, on the plus side, the days are ticking down. We're getting closer to the end of the transfer window, and there's not been anything concrete on really on any of our players leaving. So I mean, that's about as much as you can hope as the transfer window progresses, just to maintain that.
yeah, for sure. Well, we'll close things off now by looking ahead to that Blackburn game this Saturday night. They were in a replay for the FA Cup last week, I believe, so that was only confirmed quite recently that the game was going to go ahead. They would have had an FA Cup fixture if they had beaten, I think it was Newcastle they were playing. Um, but it'll be an interesting game, as you were saying before. They're 10th in the table and level on points with us, just worse goal difference. But I think they've won their last three games, so they're in quite good form as well. And of course, have former Hull City superstar Danny Graham leading the line for them. Um, it's going to be quite an interesting fixture because it's one of those games, as you said, where if we can get the 3 points, it does start to create a bit of a buffer with the teams below us, which um, is sort of, I guess, the next step that we've now reached this position where we're challenging for the playoffs, but it's also now about starting to push away from the teams below us and kind of consolidate that position because let's face it, there will come a game where we'll lose and we'll drop points and we'll need to sort of have a bit of a buffer so that we don't start sliding back down the table. And we want to be able to stay in touch with that top six. So it is one of those games where you kind of have to target all 3 points if you want to really have a serious push for the playoffs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's much the same as what we said about Villa last week. They're teams around us, and we really need to take points. And with us being level on points, I can't, you can't really accept anything other than the three. Um, I mean, they are in reasonable form themselves, I think. So that's, but I think, I mean, it should be a good game. I think basically you got two teams that are playing pretty good football, coming up against each other in similar positions on the table. I mean, it'll be good to watch anyway.
Yeah, it'll be great. And the other interesting part of Saturday night will be we'll see Bristol City taking on Borough, and Derby will be in FA Cup action. So if we are to beat Blackburn, there's a real chance that we could close that gap to 3 points to Derby. And of course, Bristol City and Borough, one of them has to drop points, preferably both, really. And Borough are only 1 point ahead of Derby. So it's kind of like it's not even a case of just looking at Derby in sixth and trying to chase them down, but Middlesbrough are suddenly within range as well, and they're in fifth. So there's a couple of teams there that are within striking distance, and if we can sort of see those rivals taking points off each other, it really becomes quite an interesting race for the playoffs.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I've just got the table up here now, and then you're looking at, Derby's 6 points ahead of us, and Borough's a point ahead of them. But like Sheffield and West Brom, they're only a win ahead of Middlesbrough.
Yeah,
Obviously the goal difference starts to stack up, but like as you're saying, like you get a win, you get a little bit closer, and then all of a sudden your target might we start changing targets. At the moment, we're chasing Bristol and Derby, and then if we can manage to catch them, then all of a sudden it's really not that far. It shouldn't be that far from the Blades and from West Brom. And then I mean, I'm probably getting a little bit ahead
yeah,
of
yeah,
myself, but just for argument's sake, beyond them, like the two automatic spots, like they're really only like a win beyond them. Like to say,
yeah,
to think where we were and to currently be like, I mean, 14 points is I can't really see us, or even 13 points overcoming that distance over the end of the season. Again, like with Leeds and Norwich, in form they are, but 10 points is still a bit of a stretch when you look at it over the whole thing. But it's 10 points I think is doable when you've still got what 18 games or something to go.
yeah. I mean, it does seem kind of f- uh, f- you know ridiculous to sort of look at trying to chase down leads, but I remember looking at the table, probably October maybe, where Leeds were maybe 20, 25 points ahead of us, if not more. I can't remember what the exact
Mm.
figure was. And just thinking, boy, that just underlines how poorly we're traveling, that this is how far we are off first. We're stuck in the relegation zone, yada yada, you know, looking likely to go down. And all of a sudden it's down to 14 points. And you think, well, really, if we can maintain this sort of run of form, the gap will just start to close even more. And as you say, of course, first and foremost, it's chasing down Derby. But as you get closer to that sixth position, you start looking higher and higher, and you never know what can happen. It really does sort of open things up quite wide that a lot of those teams are starting to look over their shoulders at us. And I found it quite funny seeing the report. I can't remember if it was this morning it came out that there was about 10 or so clubs looking at reporting leads to the EFL over their spying at Derby. Um, and I think we were one of the clubs listed as looking to complain. And the cynic in me sort of looked at the list of teams and thought, oh, that's awfully coincidental that all of the teams looking to complain about Leeds are all in and around the playoff places. And of course, would be hoping, slimmest possibility, that if there were sanctions against Leeds, they might be stripped of points. And of course, that would then benefit these other clubs. So I found it quite funny that we were sort of in and amongst those clubs. And I feel like, I wonder if the Allams are sort of looking at it saying, well, any advantage we can get to get in the playoffs. And in a way, it's kind of heartening to see. You sort of roll your eyes at the length some clubs go to sort of get one up over rivals. But at the same time, it's sort of heartening that the owners sort of care enough to go to those lengths. Um, and yeah, so no team's really out of reach at this stage.
No, and I mean, what better team to try and report than our good friends over at Leeds?
Could you imagine if we finished the season above them? I think that like they would never get to live that down, considering where we were, October compared
Yeah.
to them. I think it would just be the most utterly Leeds thing to do to collapse to that extent that they finished behind a team that was, dead to rights, basically.
Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned October, and I was just thinking about like we were talking about like how difficult it's going to be to climb up the table, but then I was thinking like if you look back, like I'm looking at the bottom of the table, and it really wasn't that long ago that we were behind Reading and Bolton and all these teams down here, and all of a sudden we've got almost a 20-point gap on them. So I guess like at the end of the day, like if we just yeah, as you said, like if we just keep performing and keep picking up points and picking up wins, then I mean there is still plenty of points to play for. So I guess anything's possible.
Yeah, I mean, I remember looking at the table and thinking that we were in the relegation spots, thinking, well, there's not a team above us that we could get above. They're all looking pretty decent. Which is pretty remarkable to think that how many of them were above. Yeah, I'm just looking at the table now. That game in October where we played Bristol City, so this was the game right before we played Bolton, where our sort of good run of form started to come from. We were on 9 points, and Leeds were on 26 points. So this was after 14 games played. We were on 9 points, they were on 26. So they were 17 points ahead after 14 games, which is, pretty ridiculous when you think about it, because that's almost, um, well, I can't even do the maths in my head, but that, the amount of points that they're better than us over that gap of 17 points in 14 games, whatever that translates to. But um, you know, the fact that we've not only closed that gap to what it is now, to the 14, well, I mean, it's 14 points, so it's 3 points closed, but the amount of teams that we've overtaken in the process is a pretty remarkable transformation, and sky's the limit at the moment.
Yeah, and just I mean just with what you're saying, like just to think that so after 14 games we were on 9 points and now we've played 28. So from the next 14 we've picked up 31 additional points. Like that's a phenomenal change of fortune. So um, I mean, I think what we're really start doing here is, I guess we're just sort of we're able just to have a look at these things. We're putting it into perspective, looking at it all in a different light. And I mean, it's overall, it's all pretty good reading, really.
Yeah, and you think if we replicate over the next 14 games something similar to what we've done over the last 14, we're looking at almost 70 points, which is pretty strongly rooted in the playoff places. I think the season we went up in second, it was, yes, it was sort of a low points total for the automatics, but I can't think we were that far over 80 points. So if we could get from 42 games something approaching 70 points, it would be a pretty remarkable total.
Yeah, well, I'm just having a look at last year's table, and Will was sixth. Sixth was Derby on 75.
Okay, yeah.
So
So if we got something like that,
yeah,
um,
um, I'm not sure, but yeah, so that was last year, and like top two were 90 points. So
yeah. I mean the season I'm thinking of that we got promoted,
yeah,
we
I
were on
know.
79 points, but yeah, that was a quite low total at the time. But yeah, look, I mean, if we were on, 65 points after 42 games played with the, final four games to play for a playoff place, it would be quite a strong position to be in. But, as the old adage goes, I guess we've got to take it one game at a time. And it's exciting to just be in the position to sort of dream of a potential playoff place, I think.
Yeah, well, I think we all know, I mean, how little we've really had to cheer about over the last few years. So it's a nice change to be in a position where we can look positively towards the end of the season.
And then just before we sign off, do you have a score prediction for the Blackburn game?
I think because we're both going so well, probably like 2-1. I think we can win. I think, but it'll be 2-1. I don't know without device and with sort of what's essentially going to amount to being sort of a bit of a mix and match sort of backline. Yeah, I think we may struggle to keep a clean sheet this week, but I think we've been talking about Grosicki and Evandro and Bowen, and you wouldn't be surprised to see Campbell get a bit more action this weekend. So yeah, I think we got the ability to score goals, but I dare say we might concede one as well.
Yeah, I think I'll agree on that, and I might go with a 3-2 win. I just think Bowen's in such good form at the moment, it's hard to contain him. And if they do try to contain him, then it probably means that Grzycki will get off the leash on the other wing. And as you say, Evandro through the middle is also looking quite good at the moment as well. So I think it'll be more a case of trying to outscore the opposition rather than contain them, given the sort of state our defence is in. Although if Mazouk can come into the side, that would be quite promising as well. So yeah, I think I could see a 3-2 win there. I think we will have too much for them, but at the end of the day, I think like the Villa game, it's almost a case of if we can at least take a point, at least sort of maintain that position in the table above them. I think that's probably the first priority, and then yeah, try and take the other 2 points as well and turn it into a pretty convincing win. It'd be a good start.
Absolutely,
Well, thank you for joining me tonight, Dan.
no worries.
Thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll be back same time next week, hopefully discussing a great victory over Blackburn and one step closer to the playoffs. But until then, come on, City. You've been listening to the official Hull City Australia podcast. For more discussion, join us on Facebook in the Hull City AFC Australian Supporters Group or follow us on Twitter at Hull City AFC Oz. The music was created by Amber and Black.
This is on fire. We're going higher and higher. There's no turning back 'cause you're out.